subject of a therapist development. Therapist development in the context of the clinical supervision on perhaps the mentoring, that relationship who someone, a master teacher, teaches the apprentice how to become a therapist. You have been a student and worked with many high-regarded teachers of psychotherapy, and you have a wealth of experience in training other therapists to become great in their work. So in that context, my first question would be, in your experience, what have you seen are the difficulties, the difficulties in helping another therapist become a therapist, or supervising someone who's becoming a therapist?
Maybe I should begin by saying that I regard being a therapist mostly a matter of becoming a human. Most people don't need to become human. The system doesn't require them to become human. It's mostly required that we renounce being human to live in this world. But I think some people, like teachers, therapists, ideally politicians, should be humans before they exercise their specific skills. And if not, it's a very damaging situation that arises. So what are the difficulties of becoming a therapist? Is the difficulty of becoming complete beings. I like to say fully brained beings. Gurdjieff used to say three-brained beings. Beings who have not just an ability to think, but an ability to love, an ability to be healthy animals, meaning something like organismic wisdom, spontaneous knowledge that pertains to the desire of wishing and willing. So, teaching a person to be a therapist in the sense of teaching a person certain skills of interpretation, I think it's a surface. And as everything that is taught in the universities have become professional schools, technical schools have lost that which originally gave them the right to be called universities, something universal. The universities have lost their universality, which would be brought back into the professions if we were taught to be human first. So most people make a mistake in their lives of wanting to be great managers, forgetting that first one needs to be the best possible human, and then do whatever one wants to do. So, what's the suffering of developing? Well, Gurdjieff used the expression conscious suffering. To grow means accepting the pains of growth, accepting seeing things about ourselves that are not comfortable to see. We have to humble ourselves a little bit to grow. If we want to be so important, we cannot take a step. If we defend our ordinary lives, so it's uncomfortable to grow. It's not inconvenient to our egos that we grow. But behind all that, there is a suffering of being an incomplete being. I think if you don't ask for the difficulties of being a therapist, but the pain, the suffering of being a therapist, is that much of the human suffering that is universal, one who's becoming a therapist has to own up to. Today, the condition of many people is not what used to be called neurotic, but what might be called neurotic.
Sorry, Claudio.
Neurotic doesn't exist in your language.
Could you expand on that concept, please?
Yes, it was invented by a Brazilian, well, French therapist who created the University for Peace in Brazil. And he has a book called Moses. It suggests something like degenerative disease, termination with oses. Instead of itis is inflammation, but oses is arthrosis, for instance, degenerative. It's like a neurosis that has become unconscious of itself. People who, well, there's nothing wrong with them except that they're dead. People who have simplified their life to take away the suffering of remembering a better way of being, remembering lost paradise. It happens to many. So Jung used to say holy neurosis, because it's like having the benefit of a pain that leads us to find the solution, to repair. It's not a calling to be neurotic. So the suffering of somebody who wants to be a therapist is somebody who is having to become a human being and having to accept the pain that comes from a number of sources. I would say one source of pain was discovered by Freud when he formulated the view that underlies all his work, that we are caged animals. We are animals, first of all. We should not forget we are evolved species of monkey. We are so self-idealizing that we tend to think of ourselves as pure essences, angelic beings who we're above nature. And all religions have cultivated this view that nature is something snaky. And nature is the world of desires, the world of the flesh, the world of appetites is intrinsically bad. We have demonized nature, and we have exploited nature, but we don't love nature. Only Franciscans and the Aborigines love nature. That's why we have an ecological problem. So part of suffering is that we have put into a cage a part of ourselves, one of our brains, our reptilian brain, our instinctual brain. I think it's a paradigm of patriarchy, but patriarchy is civilization. The civilization is the invention of patriarchy some 6,000 years ago. And it was necessary, and it was a good solution to the challenge of survival in those days. Some people took on benevolent authority, but authority degenerates in the course of time. It doesn't become so benevolent after a while. So that's one aspect of suffering. Another aspect of suffering is love deprivation or love thirst. But love thirst has to do not so much with not getting love from the outer world. Ultimately, love thirst is not does not cease when we are loved. That's a very temporary satisfaction. The deep solution to love first is coming to love ourselves. And we have lost that. We have lost our mother brain, our mothering brain, our emotional brain, I might say. In the patriarchal condition, in the patriarchal paradigm, we become Homo sapiens sapiens. We've lost the ability to love, we have disdained, or we have neglected, we have postponed so much concentration of affect and love that now that makes us dysfunctional and always wanting. And in addition to losing our instinctual brain and losing our mammalian, our old mammalian brain, which is mammalian is mothering brain, we suffer from ignorance. Like Socrates put it, nobody would suffer intentionally, nobody would be evil intentionally, it's just we don't understand. We've lost an orientation. And in the deeper sense, ignorance is a limited perspective on life that leaves out the mysterious factor behind everything. Call it the spiritual factor, even though the word spiritual has been so much used in authoritarian contexts that some people prefer to call it transpersonal factor. If we lose that, we lose the lighthouse, we lose the sense of where we're going and the possibility of ever finding what we really want. We misinterpret what we want as wanting more bread, wanting more enjoyment, more diversion. So basically my answer to your question is the suffering of a therapist that needs to grow up is just the suffering of everybody else, but it has to be, how do you say, asumido, assumed. Or,
Take responsibility for
yeah, owned.
So, some will say, and part of the research indicates that there is a difference between the supervisory, the teaching relationship, and a therapeutic relationship. Are you saying that are one of the same, or what would be their differences?
Depending what you call the teaching relationship. When I hear the expression teaching relationship, I think of two very different things. In schools, there is a kind of teaching that is, I always insist, is not education. It's just information, it's just transmission of information. The kind of teaching that should be involved in therapy is not information, it's something that is conducive to transformation. Now, it's when you, in the context of spiritual traditions, you speak of teaching or teachers, that's more like what therapy is about. That is about transformation and about ripening. And there's a factor, a very personal factor there, kind of osmotic factor, a contagion factor that is beyond the ideas and the techniques. Beyond methods.
Right now, in the field, and I'm not sure if it's just here in the US, but a lot of research and investigation is being done in terms of diversity backgrounds, different values, and the sensibility that is needed when someone is becoming a therapist and considering their traditions. And you have trained and worked with teachers, and you have also mentored many therapists from in different countries, from very different backgrounds. So I wonder what you have to say in terms of cultural differences in the context of becoming a therapist.
Well, as you know, the school I have created is more than what usually is called the ecumenical. It's a synthesis that claims to include the main facets of development across cultures. If you take religions, you can see, for instance, Christianity, the religion of most of the Western world, I suppose, hinges on two things, in its present form at least. Love, or human love, call it charity perhaps, compassion, and love of God, love of devotion. If you go to Buddhism, the main components are different. The main component of Buddhism is non-attachment. But there is a strong component of living right, virtue. If you take psychotherapy, psychotherapy is a way of growth. That surely is the most strongest in any present attempt to train therapists. And what therapy pursues is, to a considerable extent, the liberation of the instinctual self. Like if we as a civilization are at odds with instinctual nature, with our wants, with our natural wants and our natural anger, therapists decriminalize these things for people, and people begin to integrate their spontaneous self into their lives. I have tried to bring together 6 dimensions, 6 or 7. Apparently what we're doing here, and which has more elements as we go on, is SAT 2 and SAT 3, is apparently a number of things like theater, spontaneous movement, meditation, study of personality, study of one's life. But this is like the surface structure, the curriculum, but underlying there's a deeper structure. And I understand it as the development of 3 loves and 3 qualities of attention. The development of the ability to forgive, or develop empathy, to recover the mother side. It's not so much the emphasis on this particular SAT and SAT 1, it's more SAT 2. Also, devotion, there's an aspect of devotion, though it's problematic today. What kind of devotion are you going to have when there are so many religions that have different formulas that are tied to different statements of belief? Can one cultivate devotion without belief? I think one can. One can cultivate a relatedness to the highest, even if you don't use religious words. But an important part of what we do is spontaneity. The eros in the broad sense of the word. The recovery of the validation of the pleasure principle. It's like nature put in us desires, like in plants. There is what makes, how do you call it, where you get the oil, these big yellow flowers. Sunflowers. What makes sunflowers turn to the sun? Or what makes the roots of trees go and seek water in the right direction? As if with great knowledge, mysteriously. Eucalyptus can go 20 meters towards a stream. How does it know? How does it feel it? How very subtle. So we have what organic life, what our biologic existence requires through desires. And then we're raised to feel that desires are bad. And then we develop a substitute for desires, for natural desires, which we call the passions. And that's where the devilish side of human nature comes in. Not in the natural desires of a child or the animal self, but in these substitute instinctual derivatives, as Freud called them, which are the passions. So these three loves need to be developed: erotic love, the admiring love, and the compassionate love. And I speak of three kinds of attention. There's attention to the here and now, without which it's difficult to speak of self-knowledge. But there is self-knowledge as distinct from attention to the here and now. There is something like putting together the puzzle of one's life, understanding one's whole life, understanding one's relations. And that takes many observations and putting together all these observations in a bigger pattern. And then there's a deeper self-knowledge that sometimes is called wisdom. Who are we truly? What's the nature of our mind? Maybe stated in many ways. But this kind of knowledge is not just a matter of awareness. It requires a stilling of the mind. It's linked to peace and the pacification of the self. Requires the detachment from the passions. Requires non-attachment, which is an essential part of spiritual life. Becoming wise is not knowing many things, but it's looking from something like looking from afar, or looking from above, or looking at a distance, looking with neutrality. So I think these are components of becoming fully brained, is developing our three, the spectrum of love and the spectrum of attention. And they are these components. And that's my vision of the path. Oscar Ichazo symbolized it with the tarot and the symbol of the 4 ways. It's not just 4 ways, it's even more. It's like the Star of David, one triangle of love with 3 loves, another with 3 attentions, and a dot at the center, which is non-attachment.
Did you say there were 7 ultimately, or 6?
3 loves, 3 attentions, but that kind of self-knowledge, which we call wisdom, requires a 7th thing, which is you can look at it as peace, because you cannot perceive the deeper mind if there is not peace, if there's no silence, if there's agitation in the mind. It's like, as in the symbol of yoga, it said, while the surface of the mind is moving, it's like a pond where you can't see, because of the ripples of the surface, you can't see reflections. If the pond of the mind is not agitated, then you can see the sun reflected on it. So that's my theory. My theory. These are the components of psychospiritual development. And I think if one had an ambitious program for developing people, therapists, not educators, whatever, these things would need to have a place in it. To its best. Somebody asked me yesterday, what do you recommend I follow? Should I dedicate myself more to Buddhism if I want a more spiritual life? And I said, let me answer tomorrow. And in this moment I feel it's timely that I respond to that. It's idea. It's best to have a full curriculum. The ideal of becoming fully brain works better than concentrating on one thing. I'll do Vipassana from now to the end of my days, or I will do psychoanalysis from now to the end of my days, or whatever. If we become more broad in our aspiration, I think that helps.
So we have seen, let me think. So in this relationship between, you've had a very, I mean, it's obvious that you have very successful relationships with your mentors, given all you have accomplished. I find myself sometimes finding the wrong mentors or relationship with mentors who were not good experiences or did not bear any good fruit in particular. And as I am in the midst of beginning to supervise, what would be your recommendations in terms of these relationships being successful? And if you've, throughout what you've been saying, it has been implied, but if you can, for some of us are in the path of becoming supervisors and or becoming therapists, and we need to trust. I'm finding myself a difficulty saying to a trainee, someone who is in training, to tell them you need to suffer directly. They will say no, thank you.
They won't go for it.
Yes. So what would you recommend for that relationship to be successful?
It's like that, the same as finding a mentor in the spiritual path, which is also the same as getting a wife or a husband. We get what we deserve. I think it's a matter of if it takes a great sincerity to find a good teacher. If we are pursuing something for gain, or to look bigger, for spurious motives, and say, I want to grow, but that's not the bottom of it, then we probably won't have one of those greater teachers. If we, as I say, we don't want to suffer, we get a teacher that will surely lead us astray.
So I guess this is open for someone who wants to make a question. Cynthia.
Where does an attitude of service fit into all of this, or service?
It's almost the fruit of the path. We are self-centered in our needs. The more we grow, the more we can get out of the way and serve something bigger than our something bigger than our childhood wants, our neurotic ones. Now, I've tried and started to put in an element of helping people. I haven't found a definitive way to, like for instance, last year in Mexico, Jorge from Colombia did a very good job from the shamanic perspective, living service. Susie, my former wife, used to contribute that to the Sat 4, helping people turn to seeking self, to seeking something which is general, the general, el bien común, how do you say it?
Common good.
Common good.
Common good.
Common good.
It's a condition of mental health. We are political animals, but human nature has an element of politics in the best sense, not in the sense of what politics has come to be, manipulative, pressure, search for power, but caring for the collective situation. There's nothing more important for us collectively than the situation of the world as it is, and the sickness of the world. It affects us, everyone. But very few people are not only interested, but even competent to. We are very blind to something so complex if we are blind to ourselves. Well, it gets to be long to say more.
I have a question as a therapist about the two things about transference versus being relational as a therapist. Like when I notice on the first session, it's usually very pronounced. The person arrives and it's been a big process for them to get there. And they come with this very strong projection. And it's usually very pronounced, and then I notice after that it kind of tapers off.
Yes, because it's natural disappointment. We all are ready to find God, and to find a higher being in the presence of one who offers help.
And in one sense, I don't want to disabuse them of that. You know, I want to keep the like in the kind of psychoanalytic, the old-fashioned, like being kind of opaque and letting them project it all onto you. On the other hand, I really value the being relational and being transparent.
Yes, that's a good question. Positive transference brings a good harvest of good results with it. While we believe the therapist is a very high being that has a high understanding and much compassion, more. This does a kind of little miracle that happens at the beginning of therapy. And that's lost when we redimension the therapist. But Reich, he was a believer that one should do something to bring about the negative transference as soon as possible, to work through it. That it's our negative transference, our devaluation of the world, that's linked to our general destructiveness. So there's an opportunity to work through it once you see it. So the usual conception of psychoanalysis is that it works best when we fall into the transference neurosis, when we live our problem in relation to the therapist. When this relationship becomes most sick, then if we have a good therapist, that we will have an opportunity to work on it fresh, not by talking about what happens in our daily life or what happens in the past, but what's happening in the therapeutic session. a special power.
Could you comment on the almost, I think, inevitable underlying resentment that arises as someone starts to experience more dependency, and the resentment of feeling dependent on someone else who's the source of more than what you have, the envy?
Your English is so much better than mine, I have trouble understanding.
Saying the therapeutic relationship, I think there's an inevitable envy that as the other person starts to fall in love with you, they have to acknowledge their dependency. And that
Oh,
dependency makes them resent you for making them feel one down, the projection of that.
Yes. What does one do with that? Well, I think it's an opportunity to feeling the envy, feeling the resentment, opportunity to see that in perspective and not to be so driven by them, to see these things as obstacles. The more arrogant the patient, the greater difficulty of getting anywhere. But that's true of all the passions.
Thank you, Claudio.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate it. We really want you back in California.
Yes.